It's time for the Maximum PC No BS podcast, episode 239 for the week of August 12th, 2015. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about Windows 10, Skylake / Broadwell, M.2 SSD issues, and introduce Maximum PC's new senior editor. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Jimmy Thing, and joining me are Associate Editor Alex Campbell.
Hi.
Editor-in-Chief Tuan Nguyen.
Hello.
And introducing Senior Editor Jarred Walton.
Hello, everyone.
And Jarred, you're a relatively new addition to at least the podcast. You've been here for a couple of months now. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of where you came from?
So, I'll just get this out there. I'm 41 years old, so I've been around the block a while. I started out on the old Commodore 64 way back in the day, but for the last 10 years, I was the senior editor for laptops over at Tech. And, I basically reviewed all sorts of laptop hardware, did some cases and PCs and such over there, but now I'm doing GPUs, CPUs, solid-state drives, and some laptops still, so whatever they send my way.
That's a bunch.
Everything you wanted to do but couldn't do before?
That's right.
Okay. So did you review mostly like Ultrabooks, or was it like gaming notebooks too, or?
All of the above.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Gotcha. And you've been here, when did you start now?
May 11th was my first day, so I've now been here, about 3 months.
Okay. I should also mention that Jarred also works out in Washington remotely. He's a remote editor. And it's been a little bit, people have been upset. So I should also mention that it's been a while since we recorded a podcast. People have been really upset. And I do apologize for that. It's a little bit hard to wrangle a podcast together when, we have, we're introducing a new work from home policy. So people aren't always in the office at the same time. We have, Tuan was moving up from LA and things like that, and then we have a remote editor. So maybe we'll do something with Skype maybe in the future.
Well, we also had there was Computex and there was E3, and then we were actually building Dream Machine, which is coming out soon. Very, very.
It is
soon.
coming out in the October issue. So if you're wondering why it's not in September,
right? We
encountered some delays, but rest assured, it is coming soon,
and we are very excited. We can't wait to break news for that. But we're kind of biting our tongues right now.
It's been a really fun one. And so, Jarred, you speaking of the things that you review, you recently reviewed a whole bunch of things. Why don't we start off with Skylake, and then you could even talk about Broadwell. So, what do you think about those processors?
Yeah, Skylake's been interesting. Like, everyone for the last 6 months, even a year, has been like, hey, wait for Skylake. Don't upgrade right now. Wait for Skylake. So Haswell launched 2 years ago with the i7 4770K. And the thing is, Broadwell got delayed because it was this switch to 14 nanometer. And in the process, Intel was like, well, we got to give them something. So last year, we got the Devil's Canyon update for for Haswell. And that bumped clock speeds up like 500 megahertz at the top for the i7 part. So Skylake now just launched, and it actually has a slightly lower top clock speed than Devil's Canyon. And with the small architectural improvements, basically it ended up being a wash for performance. So if you didn't buy 4790K last year because you were really looking forward to Skylake, prepare to be disappointed. But it's not a bad part. The bigger deal with Skylake is arguably going to be the chipset, because they doubled the bandwidth between the platform controller hub and the processor, which means that they can do more things with like M.2 and SATA Express. And in the process, they also increased the number of PCI Express lanes off of the chipset from 8 PCI Express 2.0 lanes on Haswell and earlier up to 20 PCI Express 3.0 lanes off of the Z170 chipset. So, the chipset's a great improvement. You also get DDR4 memory support. Doesn't really matter, honestly. It's a little bit lower power, but the bigger deal with DDR4 is that you get higher densities, right? So you can now get 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte DIMMs. So with 2 and 4 slot motherboards, you're effectively going to be double the maximum capacity of memory. The interesting thing is 2 months ago, they also launched Broadwell for desktops. And this was a part that almost didn't happen, But market forces, Intel decided they would provide an update for Haswell owners and let them move to Broadwell if they wanted. So the interesting thing about Broadwell for desktops is it has Iris Pro 6200 graphics on all of the desktop parts, but the clock speeds took a big step backwards. So the i7 5775C is clocked at 3.3 to, I think, 3.7 gigahertz. So it's basically 700 megahertz slower than the previous Devil's Canyon chip. And so in theory, that makes it slower overall, but then it's got that big 128 megabyte EDRAM, which ends up being a benefit in some cases. And then you can overclock it still. So all of the parts are overclock unlocked for, the enthusiast parts. You can hit 4.2 gigahertz typically on Broadwell. You can hit 4.6, 4.7 on Haswell, on Devil's Canyon and Skylake. And when you overclock them all, it ends up kind of being this interesting tug of war where Broadwell actually ends up being faster in a few cases because of that big L4 cache. For gaming, it's like 3% faster, but that's the biggest margin of victory for gaming. It's like 3% between everything from Haswell E to Broadwell to Haswell to even probably Ivy Bridge if you wanted to go back a generation. We're just not really CPU limited in games for the most part. And DirectX 12 is not really going to make the CPU more important, right? DirectX 12 is going to make the CPU less important. So it's kind of this interesting thing where at the top end we've been effectively standing still for desktop processors for
gaming anyways, right?
Yeah. Well, and even outside of gaming. Like I did some testing of Bloomfield, an overclocked Bloomfield against an overclocked Skylake, and Skylake was 30 to 50% faster. And that's going back 7 years. So, I mean, that's kind of crazy to me because I remember back in the days where CPU performance basically doubled every 2 to 3 years, certainly every 4 years. So over a 7 year span, you'd be typically looking at a 4x improvement in performance back in the 90s. And now it's like, yeah, you've got 30 to 50% more performance after 7 years. So, those of you rocking Nehalem, you can keep on chugging along until, I don't know, Skylake E or maybe Cannon Lake E.
So you would not recommend?
Well, you can upgrade, certainly. There's reasons to do so, right? But if you're happy with the performance of a Bloomfield system, I mean, like, let's be honest, we're sitting here in front of laptops, all of us. Bloomfield on a desktop is certainly going to be faster than an Ultrabook. And with a solid state drive, it's fast enough for what most people are doing. The only reason to upgrade would be if you want the chipset improvements or if you want maybe better efficiency.
I've heard conspiracy theorists say that Intel actually has faster architecture available, but they're not, just because of self-cannibalization and maybe because the software industry or the gaming industry doesn't have the application layer to really push CPU technology. What do you think?
It's tough to say. Like, I don't know that Intel is really holding back, but like, I felt with Broadwell for desktops that they intentionally, like, it could have been clocked at 4 gigahertz without, overclocking, but they dropped the clock speeds just because they wanted to they wanted to be able to say, see, Skylake is faster or something. I don't know. But I mean, when you get right down to it, like making chips faster is getting really hard. Like clock speeds, you can't just ramp up clock speeds. We've hit this big power wall. And so effectively, you're looking for architectural improvements. And most of the architectures now are, I'd probably have to, I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say they're 4 wide, but they might be 5 wide in terms of how many instructions they pull to decode at a time. So if you say wanted to go 8 wide or 10 wide, well, in theory, you can do that. But actually extracting the instruction level parallelism in order to get a benefit from that is really, really hard. I mean, that's like supercomputer stuff. That's what they worry about. And supercomputers are running algorithms that we home users do not use. So graphics, you take Fury X and it's got 4,096 cores. You've got Titan X with 3,072 graphics cores. And graphics can basically be split up into as many cores as you want because each one can just be given a chunk of the display to render. But with our general purpose processors, you can't split certain tasks up very well. Like what's Word waiting for? Word is waiting on the user 99% of the time. So, it doesn't matter how fast your processor is, Word is going to be the same. And the internet is kind of the same thing too. It's like, your web browsing is not going to get substantially faster because your bottleneck isn't the processor. It's usually either the user or it's the bandwidth or whatever.
Also, we have to consider like the market too, because AMD hasn't shown a whole lot of drastic improvements in performance that can match what we've seen in Haswell, and a lot of times, coupled with the fact that we are seeing a lot of mobile, processing units. Mobile chips are really taking over. That may be eating into the market, so there may not be a financial incentive for Intel to really push the limit every 2 years. I mean, I don't know if that's true. Would you agree with that at all?
Yeah, so, this is kind of interesting, right? Like I just said, Bloomfield is still pretty much fast enough, and, Skylake's 30 to 50% faster. But you know what else is also faster than Bloomfield? Pretty much every Core i7 Haswell quad-core processor. And presumably the mobile versions are going to be the same story. So while the maximum performance hasn't gone up a lot, unless you're doing heavily threaded stuff and running like Haswell E, the baseline performance has definitely improved. And the efficiency has gone up dramatically. So, my old Bloomfield i7 system, the CPU had a 130-watt TDP. And today, you can have a laptop with a quad-core mobile processor that has a TDP of 45 watts, and it's like 20% faster than Bloomfield. So, 1/3 the power draw, a little bit better performance. That's definitely cool stuff to see. And that's allowed us to do things like Ultrabooks and all these mobile computers where for a lot of people, laptops are all they need, right?
Yeah, that's true.
All right, it's moving on. Another hot topic that recently kind of came out is the release of Windows 10. Have you guys been using it at all?
I haven't used it too much, but I did run into a really interesting thing, which kind of ties into the next topic, which is the SSDs. But Windows 10, one of the big things we run into initially is obviously it's a new operating system. So we've been trying to keep up with, figure out where all the drivers are for Windows 10. The turbo build that I just put together, initially that motherboard wasn't supported, which is kind of hard to predict before the launch of an OS. It's really hard to kind of project, what equipment should I get and will it be supported in the new OS? Because a lot of OEMs, a lot of builders, whether it's MSI, Asus, all those people may or may not have had the Windows 10 drivers available before launch. So it's really hard to test that as a user or a builder, I think. But as I've seen, actually, the board that I use, for instance, was supported about a week later. So manufacturers are catching up and distributing drivers for things. So I think we're going to be able to see a little better environment to benchmark and really test out, what Windows 10 has to offer, at least on the high-end, performance PCs that we build here.
Yeah, I'm hearing some conflicting reports about SLI issues with Windows 10.
Yeah.
I think there was one really big issue when it came to SLI plus Windows 10 plus like surround. Like people couldn't get that to work or something like that. Have you guys been following those issues at all?
I know Jarred and I we were talking about it earlier about how there's a specific use case where someone's got this big TV and they're using, dual HDMI inputs and, to get a 4K screen or something. And it just wasn't working, but it's, such a narrow use case that it's...
Yeah, the basic problem that we're hearing, and I haven't been able to confirm this because I don't have a 4K P60 with HDMI 2.0 display. I've got a DisplayPort 4K display, and it works fine with SLI. But apparently, if you've got SLI with Titan X is what this particular reader mentioned. So Titan X SLI with the R352 or R353 series driver from NVIDIA, something broke, and with HDMI 2.0 HD TVs, they're getting like problems with flickering and green garbage on the screen and whatever. And it's like, I mean, I talked to NVIDIA about it, and they're like, yeah, you know, that is a cutting edge problem. We're aware of it. We're trying to troubleshoot it, but it's a pretty esoteric setup.
Right.
I mean, but at the same time, it's like, hey, these guys, if they've got that sort of hardware, you're talking about $2,000 for graphics cards, a $2,000 display. You know, the rest of their computers probably equally high end. So it's like, these are the guys who spent $5,000+ on their system. And yeah, it really sucks when you spend that much money and it breaks. And they were able to confirm that this did work with an earlier driver. So something broke with a driver update, and it's been broken for about 6 months, they said. So, I mean, that blows for them. And hopefully, talking about it here, NVIDIA will have a fire lit under their butts and get it fixed soon.
Yeah, this is Windows 10?
Yeah, this is Windows 10.
This was actually on Windows 7, Windows 8, and Windows 10, but it was the Windows 10 driver branch is what basically broke it when NVIDIA created the R353 or whatever series.
So the article that we initially posted and then eventually got yanked is actually correct.
Yes and no.
In a use specific
in that instance.
Right.
And there might be problems with surround gaming or some other stuff too. So,
and they may, you know, NVIDIA's been pretty good about releasing drivers pretty regularly. So, waiting for an update that fixes things. To me, waiting for the GeForce drivers isn't that big of a deal. Actually, me personally, I think that anytime you release a new OS, it's never going to be completely smooth. As smooth as Microsoft wanted it to be, it's never going to be. You've never seen a completely smooth OS upgrade. I mean, whether it was XP to 7, 8, like something somewhere will break, and it's going to take time for drivers and the environment to mature before everything works the way you want it to. So if you're really, really, really concerned, or if you've got a special use case, might be better off staying with 8.1 for now, or 7 if you're still on 7. Stay on that for now. Wait for Windows 10 to mature. Wait for the drivers to come out. You know, wait a few months and then you can upgrade.
Yeah, I used to wait for Service Pack 1 to come out before upgrading to the newest OS myself.
There will be no Service Pack 1 for Windows 10.
They've kind of changed their
now
model.
A rolling release. They've done the Arch Linux thing, and now they make it a rolling release.
Yeah. So I've only used Windows 10 in like basically a limited capacity prior to the actual official releases when I used it the most, actually. But Jarred, have you been using it?
I was kind of like you. I didn't really switch until right before the final release came out, and then I started being like, hey, you know, let's get things ready. I installed it on like Skylake. After I finished testing, I was like, hey, let's throw it on there. So I did the upgrade for Skylake and Broadwell, and my laptop that I use for work, not this beast that I'm sporting here, but. Yeah, and so far, I've actually been really pleased with it because I was one of those detractors of Windows 8.1 where I was like, you know, that start screen thing was a travesty. It was meant for tablets and smartphones, and I just didn't care about it on a desktop or a laptop. So I installed Classic Shell was the first thing I did with Windows 8 for the past several years, and now all of a sudden it's like, hey, I can uninstall Classic Shell. This is sweet. This is sweet. So the upgrade process for me, I didn't have any problems on the 4 systems that I've upgraded, and performance. I mean, Alex looked at it. It's like Windows 8.1 and Windows 10 offered pretty much identical performance. Windows 7 was a bit slower.
Yeah, that was just an initial look at our system benchmarks. So, I mean, I'm sure that there's some special use case, again, that, you know, there will be a wild difference. But, I mean, for the few graphics benchmarks we usually use to grade systems, whether it's, you know, a pre-built system or something we build in-house, you know, didn't really see anything that compelled me to say, yes, you need to upgrade. You know, I mean, we're talking about like 3 or 4 frames.
Yeah, it's within the margin of error.
Much. Within the margin of error. I mean, you could run the benchmark 4, 5, 6, 10 times and get, you know, well within that margin. You know, variances there based on, you know, different things that are running in the background. So, I didn't, you know, as far as performance, didn't impress me. There are other things that perform better or work better or maybe faster, slower, but in terms of raw graphics, you know, in-game or in our benchmarks, not really.
Hopefully we'll see some changes when DX12, you know, starts to really roll out.
Yeah, that's going to be the big game changer, right?
Hopefully.
Unintended. You know, Windows 10, it's not just like you talk about drivers and things breaking with OS updates. Well, the big deal with Windows 10 is it switched to Windows Display Driver Model 2.0. where Vista was the last big change. And so if you remember the Windows Vista launch and everything was basically having problems for the first 6 months, and Apple had some super successful commercials making fun of Windows because of their broken drivers. I mean, it wasn't that Windows Vista was broken, it was that there were missing drivers for a lot of hardware that people wanted to use with Vista. Well, Windows 10, they've upgraded the display driver model again, and so there's going to be some work done to get things optimized. I'm sure the DirectX 12 performance that we see today in tests in the few benchmarks that exist, it's not going to be the same that we see in 1 year. We'll see some fine tuning and improvements, so that'll be cool. But yeah, we're still waiting on those actual DirectX 12 games to come out, so hopefully this fall and winter we'll see a bunch.
Cool. And then Alex, you wanted to talk about some of your M.2 SSD issues.
Right. So
no one asked me about my experience with Windows 10.
Sorry.
Go ahead. That's because you bring the MacBook Air into here. So we're like, well, maybe he's not using it at home. We don't know.
I actually am on a gaming system. It's actually really good. It's the first Microsoft OS that I liked since XP, I think.
Ooh.
Yeah.
You didn't like 7?
No, XP was just super stable, and it had matured so much that there wasn't a reason to upgrade. And then at that point, I had switched off a little bit, kind of, not so much, off of Windows. But 10 really did impress me. It's super fast, very responsive. But Cortana doesn't work really well. She doesn't catch what I say frequently, even during the training process. So yeah, it's supposed to be like everywhere. I mean, you see Cortana everywhere in Windows 10. So Microsoft is obviously trying to push Cortana as a way to interface with the computer, but it's not really going that well.
What sort of microphone are you using to speak with Cortana?
A Logitech webcam.
Because I've noticed
920.
I've noticed with my laptop, one of them actually works pretty well. I've got another laptop where it doesn't work so well. I think it's just it's a case of if you got a crappy microphone, Cortana is going to be confused or not work at all.
So this could be the return of desktop microphones.
Yeah, well,
as a thing.
Get one of these suckers.
Yeah, or you get a Dragon mic or something. Really ridiculous. But
or like a headset, a gaming headset or something.
Yeah,
like that, right?
Gaming headsets. But a lot of other desktop users may not have gaming headsets. So I feasibly see more mics that sit on the desk. Those return, because I remember that was kind of a thing as a peripheral for a long time until gaming headsets really gained steam. So we may see more of those in the market. That would be kind of interesting.
I actually use voice commands a decent amount on my Android phone.
Really?
But is there a use case for it when it comes to desktops when you have a keyboard and mouse? I feel like it works best when you don't have access to a keyboard and mouse or something like that.
I noticed that I'm significantly faster about doing everything with a keyboard and mouse, even in Windows 10. Yeah. And with Siri on the iPhone, it ended up being a gimmick, even though it could do a bunch of stuff.
I like Siri. I like the Google Voice recognition because I've been a long time user of Dragon Naturally Speaking. I don't use it all the time, but I've used it quite a bit in the past. And there's always this: you say a sentence, and then there's a second delay while it transcribes it. So maybe I was just kind of used to that. But I don't like typing in long texts on my smartphone, but I do like to be a little wordy. And so you hit the little microphone thing, and you're like, hey, I'm going to be late for getting home today. Sorry about that. Do you need me to run by the store? And it's rather than taking 40 seconds to type it out, it's you say it in 5 seconds. And the voice recognition, now granted, all the processing is done in the cloud, so your smartphone's not doing it, but it works really well. So that's pretty cool. But hey, Cortana thing it's not as useful to me on a laptop because...
Or a desktop, yeah.
Yeah, you're just not as tied to... a small screen input where typing on it is slow.
Yeah, and a lot of the things I do are very text-based anyway. So, I mean, you can't say some of these, if you were to bring Cortana to Linux and you say, set up a RAID array, so MDA, MDA.
That would be awesome. That is the holy grail, right?
It would make no sense. You can't even pronounce it.
Hey, Cortana, set up my new Linux box for me. Yeah. Hey, Cortana, build me Dream Machine 2016.
Yeah. So, I don't feel like it's as useful on a desktop. I mean, it might for certain.
I'm sure there's
people.
some use cases for it.
Yeah, there's got to be some use cases. But me personally, I don't
tablets,
see it for me.
Windows Phone.
Yeah, tablets and things like that.
Well, anyone who's got like a handicap where they can't use their motor functions well but can talk well.
Yeah.
That's definitely a benefit.
Huge leap in accessibility, which is cool.
Yeah.
I don't actually use it to send text that much, although I'm sure that's useful. I'm just worried about like it mistranslating what I say.
Yeah.
But I use it a lot for like directions and stuff like that, or like with the weather report. I mean, like what's the weather in?
Or you're just saying like, okay,
today?
Google, what's the weather going to be?
Yeah,
like
or
today?
like directions to such and such address.
Find
or
me
whatever.
the nearest gas station
Exactly.
or something like that. Yeah,
So that's how I use it.
Yeah.
Which are things that they don't really make sense to say to a desktop.
Yeah.
Like,
Use
or,
case, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Sorry for interrupting.
That's
No.
okay.
Yeah.
You have to get yours
Any
out.
other UI stuff that you like, dislike, or anything like that?
Oh, I love the new start menu, but as with every Microsoft OS release, they've left UI elements from past generation OSs in there. I'm kind of picky about the look of like icons and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
Okay.
there's like icons in there from like Windows XP
Sweet.
mixed in with 7, 8.1, and 10.
So it's just kind of a mess.
It's a hodgepodge.
Yeah, it's always been like that. And it's just weird.
The biggest pet peeve of mine when it came to Windows 8 wasn't so much Metro. I can overcome that, but it was the fact that when you clicked on like an image, like a JPEG on the desktop, it opened up into like the Metro image viewer or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that still a thing, or like what's
That's
going
the
on?
default.
Yeah, you have to.
It's still,
that's the
it's still,
default.
but that opens up in the desktop though, right? It doesn't take you to
Yeah.
like a new.
Yeah, the full screen Metro stuff is gone.
Right.
Modern interface, so they're all now windowed apps.
Yeah. So which isn't as
it's
isn't
not as
heinous,
jarring,
right?
but you can always you have to right click, go into properties,
Yeah,
and be like, change it to
image,
Windows Photo and Picture Viewer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like bring back the old version.
Right.
Earth and View. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I used to use that with Windows XP.
It's awesome.
Did you ever use ACDC?
I think so.
That was like the best, fastest image viewer.
Yeah, well, Earth and View could do like a lot of batch processing, which is why I really loved
That's
it.
why I use it.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
I
the
did.
batch processing was awesome.
Yeah. I remember back in the 90s when you had to like, this thing loads up images faster. Like now it's like
Yeah.
you have an i7 processor, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But I remember having to like, figure out which image software loaded the images the fastest. Those were the days.
Remember benchmarking MP3 transcoding? Oh, your computer's not fast enough to
Fraunhofer.
play back MP3s?
That's fun. Guess I have to go MP2.
All right, on to the SSD issues.
Right. So I was writing up this RAID article that we just put online today, and in doing so, I decided to run a bunch of benchmarks on some 850 they're 850 Evos. 4 of those, and I had a turbo build, which I'd used the HyperX Predator. The high-end super fast SSD. $400+ M.2 SSD in that system. And I found out some really interesting things about SSDs. The first one is that if you try to install Windows 10, and it might be just this SSD, might be just the motherboard, but from my experience, if you try to install Windows 10, either upgrade it or install it with the M.2 in NVMe mode, so that's using the PCIe.
Well, no, it's NVMe is instead of the AHCI.
Yeah, okay. It's NVMe mode instead of the HCI. It's basically, it'll hang, and it just takes forever. I left it. I had the machine here. It had Windows 7 on it. I upgraded it through the proper upgrade, path or whatever. And I came back in the morning, and I left. I set it at about 4:30 p.m. Left around 5. Came back the next day around 9, around 8:45 a.m. Get in the office, and it's stuck at 32%. It still is not fully gone to Windows.
But was it progressing at all?
Super slowly. It made it to 32 overnight.
Yeah, but was it stuck at 32 or did it just stay
It
there?
appeared to be stuck, but it was working, like you had little things spinning or whatever. The next thing I did is I'm like, okay, let's try a fresh install. So I did a fresh install, and this install went all the way through. Eventually, because it took like all day. By the time it was about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, it finished installing. Then it was kind of the little spinning dots that it's got when Windows boots.
Mm-hmm.
It was just stuck on that for hours. Like I left, and it still had not booted to the desktop for the first time. So I got in, started installing around 9 o'clock, and by the time 5 o'clock hit, and I was starting to go home, and I still did not have a desktop environment. So the next day I came in, I'm like, I wonder. So I switched it back to use SATA over. Thank you, AHCI. Can never remember that. And then it just installed installed as expected, perfectly fine. And then I switched it back to NVMe, and Windows was fine. So Windows didn't freak out when I switched to mode. It just didn't like to install to NVMe, which was really weird because I installed Windows 7 and Windows 8 while it was still in NVMe mode. That's the kicker. It's like Windows 7 and 8 could handle it, but Windows 10 couldn't. So
it could be a Windows 10 issue.
Yeah, it seemed like it was a Windows 10 issue. It
could be motherboard too.
It could be the motherboard because there were no motherboard drivers at the time for that motherboard. Now, MSI has since released drivers for that particular board, so your mileage may vary there, but it also means you have to have those drivers available during the installation process.
Yeah, NVMe is an interesting thing, right? It's this holy grail, like, oh man, we just reduced the latency of the command protocol, so AHCI it wasn't designed for fast solid-state drives. It was designed for hard drives. So now we've got this NVMe that's supposed to be faster for these SSDs and let them unleash their full potential. You've got the PCI Express interface that, quadruples the bandwidth over 6 gigabit SATA connection. Actually, it's more than quadruple. It's 40 divided by 6. But it's still very new and very bleeding edge at times. And so I've been playing around with some SSDs, and it's like, one motherboard that supports it. It's like, oh, by the way, your PCI Express M.2 slot, it's only a 2-lane PCI Express 2.0. Sorry, you're capped at 1 gig per second. So, it's like, oh, well, that's barely faster than the old SATA interface. So you switch motherboards, and it's like, oh, now I've got the 40 gigabits per second, and it's working properly. So, if you're looking at NVMe and you're going to spend the money on an expensive NVMe drive, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you've got the proper motherboard and chipset to make that run at its full potential.
Yeah, the other thing I ran into when I was doing my testing, I was talking to you about this earlier, Jared, is that when I was running the test, I just ran a baseline test on that NVMe drive. And then I ran it on the A50 Evo just to test throughput. And it turns out that using 4 kilobyte record lengths during the test, the 850 Evo actually comes out way on top, not by a little bit, by a significant margin over the NVMe. But once you start increasing the record length, then the NVMe kind of wins out. So there's a lot of things to do. And the interesting thing is that I know we talked about how Windows actually writes to disk, because Windows actually uses 4 kilobyte chunks by default in NTFS, but the hardware, I guess, writes to the NVMe or writes to SSDs in like 128, 256K.
Yeah, I'd have to look it up, but
chunks.
It's like the block sizes. So when you're writing to an SSD, it doesn't just program on a 4K basis. It programs a block of 256K or whatever, and so that could potentially contain, 256 divided by 4. It could contain 64 files that are each 4K each, and if one of those files changes, then what the SSD does is it will read in that 256K block, it will change the 4K file that actually is altered, and then it will write out a 256K block to a different spot because you've got wear leveling algorithms, right? So this is what SSDs do. They've been doing it for years, but it's an extra level of complexity, and all SSDs are not created equal. So even if you've got an NVMe drive, there is still the potential that some of those drives will be slower in certain use cases than an old SATA drive.
Yeah, so that was an interesting find by experimentation, something that I didn't know and I discovered by just testing. So it's one of those things, like Jared said, that use case really determines performance, and especially for storage. and also for RAID, because I was testing for RAID drives and comparing RAID performance. So, your mileage may vary based on how you use your PC. If you're writing lots of small files all the time, then you may prefer one product or mode of that, over another. If you're, say, archiving photos or video, you may be able to get away with writing those much, much larger block sizes, and that will actually increase your performance. But if you're using lots of small files, you don't want the big block sizes because it just wastes your storage space, especially on SSDs, which are still pricey. So
it's pretty interesting. Why don't we just move into reader questions now? So from Facebook, Scott Hollins wants to know, any news on the new version of Windows Server? Not that I've heard.
I have not heard of such things either.
I've not heard about Windows Server, and I'm
Still
a still
2012.
Linux guy, so I'm like, why do you use Linux? Or why do you use the Windows Server anyway? Like, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be IT people who scream at me, but I'm a Linux person. I think for a lot of servers that Linux is the way to go. But of course, there's use cases where you really need the Windows Server. So I haven't heard anything specific, but that's because I don't follow it.
I think Windows Server is still at 2012.
Which was basically based off of the Windows 7 core, wasn't it?
Yes.
Or is it? Does it have some of the Windows 8 stuff in there?
Don't think it has Windows 8 stuff in there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. AJ Starling asks, how long should we have to wait for LGA 1151 CPUs to hit the market? Both the models I've seen look great, but I'm also interested in low TDP options. So technically they're out now, aren't they?
Well,
They just,
so Intel officially launched just the i5 6600K and the i7 6700K. So they're two enthusiast chips. There's a whole bunch of leaked information floating around about all of the other like non-K series CPUs. And I believe the official word is Q3 2015 from Intel. I don't even have all the official parts, so I'm not going to go on record with anything. But basically, we know it'll be like Haswell, where there's i3 parts and there's i5 parts, and you'll have K series, you'll have non-K series. We might have some of those Iris Pro graphics versions of Skylake. I don't even know if that's in the works or if that will be more like if you want Iris Pro, go to Broadwell desktop for now. But those are all coming. I suspect probably within the next month or two, there will be a wider launch of all the remaining processors.
and we were talking about this morning, but the next enthusiast chip, we both think it's probably going to be Skylake E and not Broadwell E, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, Broadwell, we kind of didn't even expect to see a desktop chip version of that, and then it was done for whatever marketing reasons. There were pressures where people wanted it, and so they made it, and it's socket compatible and even chipset compatible if you can find an updated BIOS for your motherboard with the Haswell chips. But Broadwell E, I don't think they'll even bother with that because there's they don't have.
It's a laptop chip.
Yeah, well, and Broadwell, it's like, well, Broadwell for desktop, they at least gave you Iris Pro graphics, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what are they going to do with a hex core or octal core, enthusiast chip? It's like, well, you don't have graphics, so they could still put on a gigantic EDRAM, but I don't think they will. I think they'll skip Broadwell E and go straight to Skylake E.
Okay.
Which is, I think the last I heard was Q3 2016.
Oh, I didn't know that. Camel has a very serious question. This rash on my inner thigh, how do I get rid of it?
Amputation.
Amputation. I think somebody in the comments was saying Gold Bond, and that really works.
Apparently.
I am not an expert on this matter, so
just use baby powder, talcum powder.
Overclock your heart. That will actually help. Tweak that pacemaker.
yeah. So sorry, man. We're not the best people to ask on this. Maybe subscribe to Maximum Itch or something.
Runner's World, they might have something. Who knows?
Yeah. Sho Kikugawa, he's actually a freelancer with us, asks, what do you guys think about the security warnings as of late? Like cars getting hacked, Android being poked full of holes, etc.?
Ooh, this is something that I've been, loosely following on Twitter. I see, things about. I'm sure many of our, listeners and viewers have probably read or heard about the Chrysler hack, where a writer, I believe it was from Wired, right? Was it from Wired? I don't know. He basically, this journalist starts driving down the road, and these hackers text him and say, "We're going to hack your car now." And he had been working with them, so he knew it was coming. He's like, "We're going to hack your car now. Don't freak out." And they stop his car in traffic. He was going 50 miles an hour on the highway, and they were able to stop his car.
Ouch.
Right? So this has been behind a big Chrysler recall for a lot of their stuff, and that was a big issue. And also there is the story about Android. Actually, I think it was it Ars Technica or someone did a big article about why you see all these holes in Android right now and why they're not going to get fixed. And the Android answer was pretty much, it's because Android, it doesn't matter what Google does to fix Android. It's because since the manufacturers have to refine that to fit their device, and then they have to push that to the carriers, by the time it gets down to the carrier, you're never going to see it. I have a Galaxy S3, and they still haven't pushed, like Android, 5. They're not going to ever push Android 5 to a Galaxy S3, but a lot of people have those.
Just buy the new version, man.
Right. It's basically forcing people for security to buy the new version because they're never going to push the update to older devices. And that's basically the root problem behind Android, is that, I think the vast majority of Android devices are still like Android, hardly on Android 4, let alone Android 5. So they're not going to get these security fixes.
That's why I have the Nexus device myself. But yeah, that's one thing that really upsets me about mobile phones in general. Like, for instance, if you were to play around with your 10-year-old desktop, you could install Windows 10 on it just fine.
Install Linux on it. It'll work great. I promise.
That too. But yeah, if you have an S3, like, good luck trying to get the the latest update.
Yeah, you can do it. You can try to get like CyanogenMod, but then you're pretty much your SOL is in terms of your warranty. You take that phone back, and it's towards the end of its life. You're not going to get it serviced by the carrier or anyone else because, you installed a custom ROM. Well, screw you, right? So that's basically what happens is if you try to fix things yourself in the mobile market, you get screwed, by the carrier, by the retailers, because they're not going to support anyone. Even though the operating system is based on open source, it's a very, very proprietary system that propagates it, which is really kind of weird. And, that's one of the things that, why I'm kind of an open source person is because you see all these security holes everywhere. The Office of Personnel Management that got hacked, which, by the way, my information's in there. Part of the reason I'm mad is because, some of their machines were running Windows XP. It's past its support life. The federal government's paying Microsoft to support it, but they're still running XP machines when they have social security numbers, hit employment histories, places where people lived, relatives, those types of things. And they didn't take the time to update their system. Because they have to. It's built on a proprietary system, so they can't actually they can't hire anyone to go in and fix it. They have to call the vendor to fix it and hope the vendor can fix it for them. And if they don't want to pay, to upgrade all their systems to Windows, Server 2012 or whatever they should be upgrading it to in order to fix those systems, then it doesn't get fixed, right? In an open source system, all I have to do, there's a security hole in, OpenSSL. Cool, I just do, one command. I upgrade all the software on my Arch box and it's done. I don't worry about security there because, I hear about something. I just wait until that project, until they push, a patch, and then I download and install it, and it's done. I don't see that in proprietary software.
I think Alex is preaching the Linux master race message right now.
Yeah.
It's funny. I'm like a huge fan of the whole dystopian, futuristic world where technology has become almost too much of our lives, and we are very much living in that today, right?
Oh, yeah, I agree.
I mean, like, the whole Internet of Things, it's like, you talk about problems with smartphones, it's like, okay, smartphones, they're still reasonably current. Like, what do you think is going to happen when we've got IoT devices everywhere in our house? Like, are those all going to get patched? And so, like, if you're like me and you're a fan of cyberpunk and you've read like the Neuromancer books and the Sprawl series and Stevenson's Snow Crash and whatever, it's like, or Deus Ex, the video games, it's like we are very much entering that realm where it's like, oh yeah, you're going to get hacked on all sorts of things. And I kind of, like Windows 10, there's a bunch of people saying, hey, like it's sharing your information and you probably don't want to do this and turn this off. And it's like, I'm almost at the point where I'm like, you know what, I just can't care anymore, because anyone who wants to find information on you, there's so many flaws in our system that they will find it. So I'm just like, whatever.
Right. I mean, we're living in a society where we're increasingly reliant on technology. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're in the Bay Area and you're trying to find employment of almost any kind and you don't have a cell phone, good luck. Like, you're not going to get too far. It doesn't matter if you're a welder or if you're, making hard drives for Hitachi. It doesn't matter. Like, if you don't have a cell phone so people can contact you, it's that's expected in a lot of places in the U.S. So, things like cars and Internet of Things, as more and more things become connected to the Internet, it feels like, especially with this Chrysler thing, that they're innovating and creating all these interesting technologies, which are really useful, but it feels like there's not as much emphasis put on security. Maybe it's because maybe because the people who are creating the systems don't know.
Security is hard.
Yeah, security is hard. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just because the people don't know. Maybe they don't have it audited enough. Maybe, I don't know how Chrysler develops their software, but they got in trouble for doing that. They basically had a hole. They had to issue, like an electronic recall, and I think they were able to push an update. Just plug something in, they can update the software. But when you have issues like that, and especially as it reaches infrastructure, vehicles, things in the physical world, it's no longer just information. Then you're manipulating reality remotely, and that can be really dangerous. I mean, that's one of the premises behind, Ghost in the Shell and all these other, cyberpunk things, is that you can manipulate reality by manipulating some code or, using an exploit to get through. So security is going to become, in my view, one of the most important things as we go forward, and probably the next decade, at least on the electronic side of everything.
Right. I think we were talking about this the other day. Chrysler is known to be, a company full of mechanical engineers, not programmers.
Right.
Right. So
they make cars. They don't make software. That's not That's not what they're trained. That's not what they have done for the past, 50, 60 years, or however long they've been around. That's not what they do. So for them to, Ford opened up a branch here in Silicon Valley to research, new technology and to get some of the best talent. But, if you're a programmer coming out of, Berkeley or Stanford or UCLA, if, who are you going to go work for? What sector you work for? Google, Facebook, or Ford? That's a hard sell for Ford. Like, they really got to work to attract really good talent. So, car makers aren't the only ones. I mean, you have everyone who's doing Internet of Things. So it's kind of I think companies are kind of in a tough spot where they have to innovate and create their product, but security's hard and it's expensive. So,
they first have to solve the problem, right? Like the whole self-driving vehicle, right? I mean, DARPA had that challenge for years, and then finally, is like there was this watershed moment where Stanford and several other teams managed to complete the 200 or 300 whatever mile obstacle course with their robotic vehicle. But it's like the whole purpose of those vehicles was like, we're going to make this vehicle that drives itself. No one was sitting there going, oh. And it's going to be hardened and secure so that no one can hack it, because they're like, dude, we just want to get it to drive.
Sure.
Right.
We want it to go from A to B. And then all of a sudden, I was a computer science major, so it's like, you're really excited. You're like, dude, look at this cool project I did. Like, I've made code that does something new. And then all of a sudden, a hacker comes along and goes, I can break your code. And you're like, oh, crap.
Yeah, as a coder, you're like, what's the easiest way I can do this just so I can get it done?
Yeah.
And then when someone else breaks it, you're like, oh, now I have to harden that code. Oh, this is much more difficult than I initially thought. So that's part of the problem is, it's easier to prototype and build something out really fast than it is to build it out and make it really robust and secure as you go.
And it's like all things, right? It's a lot harder to build something that's great than it is to destroy. So, it's like, hey, how much technology goes into building, a nice house? It's like, well, it takes a lot of work, but anyone with a little
sledgehammer,
sledgehammer, stick of dynamite, whatever, they can demolish it really quickly. And it's like, for better or for worse, software and code is kind of like that, where it's like, to go over every line of code and make sure it's secure and not open to buffer overruns and all this stuff. It takes so many extra man hours, and things slip through the crack all the time. I mean, I don't even know how many millions of lines of code go into, modern operating systems, but it was like 10 million back in the day when I was in college, and we've gone well beyond that point now.
Yeah. When there was Heartbleed and all that stuff with OpenSSL, I mean, that piece of software is used almost universally on the internet. Has been around for years and years and years. Is open source, but it took that long for someone to audit it and say, "Oh, there's a vulnerability here. Someone should fix this." The fact is, we rely on a lot of technology that we just take for granted, and it's hard to really question a lot of that underlying code because it's been there for so long. So that's going to be interesting. I think that's always going to be an issue. And as more and more, as a lot of our society is more and more reliant on code, the security behind it is just going to be more and more important. And I think you're going to see more and more stories about things, about financial institutions, about governments, about everyone, getting broken into as people, if they're not on top of their game and they're not spending money, paying people to audit their stuff and really test it, and paying those white hats to go out and really test their systems. And
what color's your hat, Alex?
I would say light gray.
All right.
A touch of black. It's got polka dots.
Terry Matthews asks, when are we going to see Dream Machine 2015? And as I mentioned before,
October.
Yes, normally comes out in September, but it will be coming out in October. And I think you guys will be excited to see it. I think it's, one of the best Dream Machines yet. And without giving away too much, I will say that it's sort of out of this world.
It should be on the store shelves mid-September, yeah?
It's coming out. It's actually going to be, it's actually going to be hitting subscribers at the end of the month.
Oh.
Yeah.
So the end of this month. So, okay.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah, because we've got that 13 issue per year cycle, so,
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yep. It's very confusing.
Yeah.
But I have to have a calendar on my phone to.
We've invented time travel.
So yes, it's going to be a really good issue. We got our copies today, and it looks really nice. We wish we could show everybody, but you have to wait.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about it on the next podcast or the podcast after that. Travis Richard asks, why are you selling out to Microsoft so hard? So here's the thing.
I just went on a tirade about how proprietary software is dangerous, but no, there's that.
So here's the thing. I mean, you guys are relatively new here. A lot of our readers seem to think that we're in the pockets of Microsoft, even though we have criticized them a ton in the past. I don't know why it keeps creeping up. We did review Windows 10. We gave it like a 85 or 85, 85, right?
Yeah, 85. Okay.
Which is a good score, but it's not it's not something that
doesn't floor us or anything.
Yeah. So I don't know. I guess some of our readers want us to be more critical of Windows, even though I feel like we're being pretty critical and fair.
Yeah. And Alex continually promotes Linux.
So. It's my favorite OS, and it works. Except for the Wi-Fi driver on
yes, I was
going
to mention. You were just mentioning right before this podcast.
Wi-Fi is still like one of those things that just doesn't work 100% of the time in Linux. And it's just you take your chance with laptops, but
yeah.
But well, I mean, Microsoft they've made decent. I mean, a lot of people railed against Windows 8.1, but if once you set it up to boot directly to desktop, really not that bad. Yeah. If you can set it up so it passes the Metro screen. A lot of people don't know that. The setting's kind of hard to find sometimes. if you don't know where it is. But it, the fact that I can just do Windows S and just search for anything I want is really handy. I thought.
How much is Microsoft paying you to say that?
$0.
Exactly. Windows Windows 8 was kind of interesting too, because for all the complaints about the user interface, I mean, like I say, I installed Classic Shell on it and didn't really bother with the start screen. But for all those complaints, they did make some changes to the kernel that improved boot times quite a bit. And so if you had a fast system with an SSD on a laptop, I've seen laptops that boot up in literally from off to Windows desktop in 8 seconds.
What I don't like concerning boot with Windows is this idea of secure boot, and they can go cram that right up their butt. Seriously, because anyone who wants to install Linux, secure boot and all these.
This is going to anger the Microsoft gods, and they're not going to give us the money hats anymore.
Oh, we'll just have to switch to Ubuntu. But
I don't think they pay very much, Alex.
They don't. I don't know. I don't know how much money Canonical's making, but. And the thing is, the idea of this secure boot and only using approved kernels to boot to, that's really a touchy area, and I really wish motherboard manufacturers wouldn't be as on board with that, because when you make it harder for me to use the operating system not everyone wants Windows. Some people like to dual boot, those crazy folks. Then it drives me away from that product. But I don't know. I think it's kind of it's crowding out any competition from Microsoft. And I think that's dangerous when you're building that into the BIOS, it's a much harder nut to crack. It's one thing for you to change something within your OS. It's a much harder nut to crack if it's being hard baked into the hardware you're buying. The hardware itself is going to try to force you into using a certain OS, and that I really don't like. I like using the hardware the way I want to use it. Whether it's Windows, Linux, BSD, Solaris. I don't even think you can probably run Solaris on desktop hardware, but whatever you want to use, you should be able to use it. And I don't think that a hardware manufacturer, should be, especially when you're buying, parts that you're putting together, shouldn't be forcing you into a certain OS. I think that's kind of I think that's a little nefarious, but.
One final question from Twitter. Sang asks, what's the difference between Celeron N and Atom Z in mobile? Ooh. Is Celeron better than Atom? Is higher number better? Is it battery life versus power?
So Atom kind of got a bad rep because Atom was their
the
low
notebooks.
Power.
Yeah,
well, and it started in those netbooks.
Netbooks, right?
Everyone was like, "Oh, look how cool this is! This is a $200 netbook." And then they realized that the $200 netbook was really slow.
Yeah.
And the thing is, though, if you're running a smartphone OS, like Android, all of a sudden Atom isn't that bad. Atom's actually pretty competitive. As far as the Z versus the Celeron stuff, my understanding is the Atom brand from Intel is now their lowest tier of performance. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad product. It also is very power.
It's a lot better now.
Yeah, and it's very power friendly, right? It's designed to go into smartphones. So most of the Atom things are going into smartphones or tablets. And then the Celerons that are based on the Atom architecture are going to be, at least my understanding is they will be clocked higher or have more cache or more cores or all of the above compared to the Atom parts. And they'll probably also have a higher TDP. So if you're looking at a laptop, Atom is going to be slower and generally worse than Celeron. But that said, the Celeron based off of Haswell at least was still about twice as fast as the Celeron based off of the Atom architecture. So if you're looking at a laptop and you're shopping Intel, try to stay away from Atom at all costs is my advice.
Unless you just need a little
like a Chromebook or something, like a Chromebook, right?
Yeah, you could do a Chromebook.
Well, even Chromebook though, it's I've tested and it's okay, Chromebook with a Intel Atom based architecture and Chromebook with an Haswell Celeron. It's the Haswell version's noticeably faster and, ironically, got better battery life. So that was with the Acer I think that was Acer C720 the last time I played around with it.
Just install Debian Linux and then use XFCE.
And any chance he gets to like pimp Linux.
XFCE is really lightweight, and it'll work well even on slow processors. So
yeah,
gotcha.
I had a netbook and I put that on there. I actually ran a Ubuntu.
But it would still be faster if you had a Haswell or the core architecture.
Of course, yeah.
Hey, did the Wi-Fi work?
The Wi-Fi did work on that machine. Yeah. Strangely,
Gotcha.
All right.
It also had a actually plug in the side for network. It had an RJ45. So there's that.
So we go Atom, Celeron, Pentium, then Core i3, i5, i7 is basically the architecture. And then if you're wondering where AMD slots into things, AMD has like overlapping SKUs as well. So like their A4 APUs are sometimes based off of what are they called? The cat cores, Jaguar, Puma, whatever. No, Kaveri is not the cat core. So Kaveri is their high performance core, and Carrizo is the latest extension to Kaveri. Those are usually A4, A8, A10, A6, A8, A10. So the A4 is the Atom equivalent. A6 is overlapping, so you'll get somewhere it's like the slow cores, somewhere it's the faster cores, and then there's also like the E cores and such. So yeah, it all gets to be a bit of a mess. Your best bet is to like look at the product you're wanting to buy and then research it and try and find some performance reviews, because just going off of the product name alone is often going to end up confusing you or leaving you with the wrong product.
Gotcha. All right, I think that about wraps it up. I know, Jarred, you have to be out of here pretty soon. So you can check us out online at www.maximumpc.com. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can subscribe to us on Google Play, iTunes, Kindle, Nook, and Zinio. On behalf of the Maximum PC crew, thank you for listening.